Out there in the deep woods, past the last trail marker beyond where the maps end, something is waiting. Tonight we go there together. Welcome to the Park Keeper's Stories. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, have you ever felt watched in the dark? First, let me just say, I am a former U.S. park ranger. I have been assigned to various parks all throughout the USA back in 1991, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I would encounter on Royale National Park in Lake Superior. The assignment came in mid-July. Royale was different from the other parks I'd worked. It wasn't just remote. It was isolated in a way that gets into your bones. Sitting 45 miles from the nearest mainland, the island existed in its own world, surrounded by the vast, dark waters of Lake Superior. The park encompassed the entire island and its surrounding waters, over 850 square miles of wilderness that could swallow a person whole without a trace. My job was to patrol almost 100 miles of backcountry and write reports on the conditions of several trails. Simple enough, I thought. I'd done similar work in Yellowstone and Glacier. But Royale was different. The isolation was absolute. When the last ferry departed in late fall, you were truly alone until spring. Even during peak season, you might go days without seeing another soul in the backcountry. The island's ecosystem was unique, a closed system where wolves and moose had lived in delicate balance for decades. The thick boreal forest dominated the landscape, with towering spruces and firs creating a canopy so dense that even midday felt like dusk beneath it. The forest floor was a carpet of moss and fallen needles that muffled every sound, creating an eerie silence that could play tricks on your mind. I would rotate my patrol route every couple of weeks to avoid getting too familiar with the backcountry and keep myself alert. Experience had taught me that complacency was dangerous in wilderness work. When you stop paying attention, when you start assuming you know every sound and shadow, that's when the forest can surprise you. The other rangers had warned me about certain areas of the island. Not officially, of course, the Park Service didn't recognize such things in reports. But over coffee and during shift changes, the old-timers would share stories. They'd tell you about places where your radio would mysteriously lose signal, where compasses would spin wildly, where the very air seemed to thicken with an inexplicable tension. Just stick to the marked trails, veteran ranger Tom Carlson had told me my first week. His weathered face was serious as he studied the map spread across the station table. Especially around the Greenstone area, that place has a way of affecting people. When I pressed him for details, he'd only shaken his head. You'll understand when you get there. The Native Americans had been coming to Royale for over 40 years, primarily to mine the copper deposits that gave the island its original name. But they'd also used the greenstone, a tough, metamorphic rock perfect for making tools. The northeastern point of the island, where the greenstone was most abundant, held particular significance in their culture. It was a sacred place, but also one they approached with caution. The stories varied depending on who told them, but certain elements remained consistent. The area around Greenstone Cove was said to be haunted not by spirits, but by something older, something that belonged to the island itself. The Native Americans spoke of a guardian, a creature that watched over the sacred places and didn't welcome intruders. I dismissed these stories as folklore when I first heard them. Every remote wilderness area had its legends, its boogeyman tales designed to keep people from wandering off the beaten path. But as the weeks passed and I became more familiar with the island's rhythms, I began to understand that Royale operated by different rules. The weather could change in minutes, turning a calm crossing into a life-threatening ordeal. Fog would roll in from nowhere, so thick you couldn't see your own hands. And the island was full of sounds that had no apparent source. Strange calls that echoed through the forest at night, footsteps that seemed to follow you through the underbrush, and sometimes on the still air, what sounded almost like human voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. During the first part of late August, I rotated to the west end of the island to patrol the Greenstone area. The anticipation had been building for weeks. This would be my first extended patrol in the region the other rangers spoke about in hushed tones. The boat ride to the Greenstone access point took 40 minutes across choppy waters. Lake Superior was showing her temperament that morning, with 3-foot swells that made even the sturdy Park Service boat pitch and roll. The captain, a grizzled local named Eddie who'd been running supplies to the island for 20 years, kept glancing at the darkening sky. "Weather's turning," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "You sure you want to be dropped off out there? Could be a rough few days." I assured him I'd be fine. I had my gear, my radio, and enough supplies for a week-long patrol. What could go wrong? As we approached the landing area, the forest seemed to press down toward the water's edge. The trees grew right to the shoreline in places, their branches hanging out over the dark water like gnarled fingers. The Greenstone Point was visible in the distance, a massive pile of rocks jutting out into Lake Superior, dark and imposing against the gray sky. Eddie helped me unload my gear, but he seemed eager to be gone. "Radio check every 12 hours. He reminded me, though we both knew that was standard protocol. "Weather Service is calling for storms midweek. Might have to pick you up early if it gets rough." After the boat disappeared around the point, leaving only the sound of waves against the rocks, I shouldered my pack and headed into the forest. The Greenstone Shore Trail cut through some of the thickest spruce forest on the island. Within minutes of leaving the water, I was enveloped in a green twilight that seemed to muffle all sound except the crunch of my boots on the narrow trail. This part of the island felt different immediately. The air was heavier, somehow thicker, and carried scents. I couldn't identify something musky and wild that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The trees here were older and larger than in other areas I'd patrolled, their massive trunks disappearing into the canopy high above. Some were easily 4 feet in diameter, ancient sentinels that had watched over this place for centuries. The trail itself was well maintained but narrow, just wide enough for single-file hiking. It wound through the forest following the natural contours of the land, occasionally offering glimpses of Lake Superior through breaks in the trees. But mostly, it was just green, endless, overwhelming green that seemed to close in around you the deeper you went. I made good time that first day, covering nearly 10 miles and checking 3 trail shelters along the route. Each one was empty, showing no signs of recent use. The silence was profound, no bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the ever-present mosquitoes seemed subdued. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. That night, I made camp at a designated site near Greenstone Cove. The site offered a clear view of the water and the famous greenstone formations. In the dying light, the massive rocks looked like sleeping giants, their dark forms mysterious and vaguely threatening against the purple sky. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency and prepared a simple meal on my camp stove. The routine was comforting, a reminder of civilization in this primordial place. But as darkness fell, the island began to reveal its true nature. The sounds started just after sunset. Not the normal forest sounds I was accustomed to, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of loons, the whisper of wind through branches. These were different. A low groaning that seemed to come from the earth itself, occasional snapping sounds like massive branches breaking, and something else, something that might have been breathing, deep and rhythmic, just at the edge of perception. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the island night and trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Every ranger learns to identify the sounds of their environment. You know the difference between a bear snuffling through underbrush and a deer picking its way through fallen leaves. You can distinguish the bark of a fox from the howl of a wolf, the splash of a beaver from the call of a loon. But these sounds defied classification. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sometimes close enough that I'd reach for my flashlight, sometimes so distant they might have been imagined. The most unsettling thing was how they seemed to move, circling the campsite in a slow, deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. I must have dozed fitfully because I woke with a start to find the forest completely silent. My watch showed 3:17 a.m. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, as if something had thrown a blanket over the entire world. Even the constant murmur of waves against the shore had stopped. That's when I heard it for the first time, the sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. A long, low moan that started somewhere deep in the forest and rolled across the landscape like thunder. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, filled with a sadness and longing that seemed to reach into my chest and squeeze my heart. The sound faded slowly, leaving the forest in its unnatural silence. I lay there for hours, straining to hear any repetition, any clue to what might have made such a sound. But the silence continued until dawn, when the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as the sun climbed higher. The next morning brought no answers, only questions. I found no tracks around my campsite, no signs that anything had been near during the night. The forest looked exactly as it had when I'd gone to sleep, peaceful and serene in the morning light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in the shadows between the trees was studying me with intelligent, patient eyes. The second day of my patrol took me deeper into the Greenstone area, following the shore trail as it wound through increasingly dense forest. The morning had dawned clear and cool, with a crisp breeze off Lake Superior that should have made for perfect hiking weather. Instead, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the unease that had settled over me during the night. The trail here showed less maintenance than the more popular areas of the island. Fallen logs crossed the path more frequently, and in several places, the forest seemed to be actively reclaiming the route. Branches hung low enough that I had to duck, and more than once I had to push through undergrowth that had grown across the trail. This section of the island had a different character entirely. Where other areas felt like wilderness preserved for human enjoyment, this felt truly wild, a place that tolerated human presence but didn't welcome it. The trees grew larger and closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so dense that very little sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was still and heavy, carrying that same musky scent I'd noticed the day before, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. I'd been hiking for about 3 hours when I came across something that stopped me cold. Carved into the bark of a massive white spruce were symbols, not random scratches or natural marks, but deliberate carvings that looked ancient. The marks were deep and weathered, filled with moss and lichen that suggested they'd been there for decades, possibly longer. I'd seen similar carvings at other parks, usually historical markers left by early explorers or Native American trail markers, but these were different. They seemed to form a pattern, almost like a warning or a boundary marker. The central symbol looked like a stylized hand or claw, surrounded by other marks that might have been trees or mountains or something else entirely. As I studied the carvings, that feeling of being watched intensified. The forest around me was completely still, no bird songs, no rustling leaves, even the ever-present mosquitoes had disappeared. It was as if every living thing in the area had suddenly decided to hide. I took photos of the carvings for my report and continued down the trail, but the unease stayed with me. The marks had been placed where anyone following this route would see them, impossible to miss. If they were boundary markers, I was clearly crossing into territory where I might not be welcome. The trail began to descend toward the shore, winding through a series of small clearings that offered glimpses of Lake Superior through the trees. It was in the third of these clearings that I first saw it. I had stopped to check my position on the map when I heard the sound, that same low moaning I'd heard during the night, but closer now, much closer. It started as a deep groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, then rose in pitch to become something almost like a sputtering sound, as if whatever was making it was struggling to breathe. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead of me, just beyond the next bend in the trail. I stood perfectly still, listening as the strange vocalization continued. It wasn't constant, it would build to a crescendo, fall silent for several seconds, then begin again. There was a rhythm to it that suggested distress or pain, like an animal in trouble. My first thought was that I'd found an injured bear or moose. Both species were present on the island, and an injured animal could make unusual sounds. My training kicked in. Approach carefully, assess the situation, radio for backup if needed, and under no circumstances put yourself in danger trying to help a wild animal. I moved forward slowly, following the trail as it curved around a stand of massive spruces. The sound grew louder as I approached, and I could hear other noises now, a rustling in the underbrush, what sounded like heavy breathing, and occasionally a snapping sound like branches breaking under weight. When I rounded the bend, I found myself looking into a large clearing, perhaps 50 yards across, dominated by several old fire pits arranged in a rough circle. The area had clearly been used as a camping spot for many years, possibly decades. The fire rings were made of stones gathered from the shoreline, and the ground around them was worn smooth by countless feet. But it was what lay beyond the fire pits that captured my attention. About 50 feet away, near the far edge of the clearing, something dark was lying in the tall grass. At first glance, it looked like a large animal, something on 4 legs, definitely big enough to be a bear or possibly even a moose. The creature was still making that strange moaning, sputtering sound, and as I watched I could see it moving slightly. Whatever it was seemed to be in distress, possibly injured or sick. The rational part of my mind cataloged the situation. Large animal, potentially dangerous, showing signs of illness or injury. Protocol dictated that I observe from a safe distance and radio for guidance. But something about the scene felt wrong. The animal's position was strange. It was lying in an unnatural pose, almost as if it had been arranged rather than having collapsed naturally. And the sounds it was making didn't quite match any animal I knew. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like a form of communication. I took out my binoculars and focused on the creature. From this distance, even with magnification, I couldn't make out clear details. The tall grass partially concealed whatever was lying there, and the shadows cast by the surrounding trees made it difficult to see clearly. The general shape suggested a large quadruped, but something about the proportions seemed off. The moaning continued, occasionally rising to that strange sputtering sound. As I listened, I began to notice other details that increased my unease. The sound seemed too loud for the size of the animal I was observing, and there was something about the rhythm that reminded me more of human speech than animal vocalizations, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to form words but lacked the proper vocal apparatus. I stood there for several minutes, watching and listening, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature occasionally shifted position, confirming that it was alive, but it never lifted its head or showed any awareness of my presence. Given the wind direction, it should have caught my scent by now if it were a normal animal. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of approaching directly, I decided to circle around the clearing to get a better view from a different angle. The forest was thick enough to provide cover, and I could potentially get closer without putting myself directly in the creature's line of sight. I backed away from the trail and began working my way through the underbrush, moving as quietly as possible. The going was tough. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen branches and moss that could betray my position with a single misstep. But my years of wilderness experience served me well, and I managed to make my way around the clearing's perimeter without making significant noise. As I moved, the moaning continued, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like movement in the tall grass. Whatever was out there was definitely alive and active, but it seemed content to stay in the same general area. That was unusual behavior for an injured animal, which would typically seek shelter or water. When I reached a position that should have given me a clear view of the creature from the side, I raised my binoculars again and carefully searched the tall grass where I'd seen the dark shape. I swept the area methodically, checking every shadow and grass clump. The creature was gone. I lowered the binoculars and looked again with my naked eyes, thinking perhaps I was looking in the wrong spot. But the area where I'd clearly seen something large and dark just minutes before was empty. The tall grass showed no signs of disturbance, no trail where something heavy might have moved through it. Yet the moaning continued, coming from the exact same location where the creature should have been. A chill ran down my spine as the implications sank in. There was no way something the size of what I'd observed could have gotten up and moved away without my hearing it. The underbrush was too thick, the ground too covered with dry leaves and branches. Even if it had moved while I was circling the clearing, I should have heard something: footsteps, rustling vegetation, breaking branches. But I'd heard nothing except that continued moaning, which now seemed to be coming from empty air. The forest around me had gone completely silent again. No wind rustled the leaves, no insects buzzed, even the distant sound of waves on the shore had faded. It was as if the entire island was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when the truly terrifying thought struck me. What if the creature I'd seen had never been there at all? What if the moaning was some kind of lure, designed to draw me into the open where I'd be vulnerable? What if I was dealing with something that was intelligent enough to set a trap? The idea was so disturbing that my rational mind immediately rejected it. Animals didn't think that way. Even the most clever predators relied on instinct and opportunity, not elaborate deceptions. But as I crouched in the underbrush, listening to those impossible sounds coming from an empty clearing, rational thought seemed increasingly inadequate. The moaning changed then, becoming deeper and more urgent. It rose to that sputtering sound again, but now it seemed almost like laughter, a deep, rumbling sound that had nothing humorous about it. And underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it, I could swear I heard something that sounded like my name being called. Every instinct I developed in 20 years of wilderness work was screaming at me to leave, not walk away, not retreat, carefully run, Get out of the area as fast as possible and don't look back. The feeling was so strong it was almost overwhelming, a primal terror that bypassed my rational mind and spoke directly to the part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive when the world was full of things that hunted humans. I didn't argue with that instinct. I turned and crashed through the underbrush, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I fought my way back toward the trail, driven by a fear so intense I could taste it. Behind me, the moaning rose to a crescendo that seemed to follow my retreat, as if whatever was making the sound was laughing at my flight. I didn't stop running until I reached the trail, and even then I kept moving at a fast walk, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking as I tried to check my compass and map. It took me an hour to calm down enough to think clearly. By then I was miles away from the clearing, following the shore trail as it wound along the edge of Lake Superior. The normal sounds of the forest had returned, birds calling, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant splash of waves on rocks. It was as if I'd passed through a pocket of wrongness and emerged back into the normal world. But the memory of those sounds, and the impossible sight of a creature that vanished while continuing to make noise, stayed with me. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps I'd been looking at the wrong spot when I circled the clearing. Perhaps the creature had moved while I was making my way through the underbrush, and the acoustics of the forest had made it seem like the sounds were still coming from the original location. None of these explanations felt adequate, but they were all I had. The alternative that I'd encountered something that operated outside the normal rules of the natural world was too disturbing to seriously consider. I spent the rest of that day patrolling the outer edges of the Greenstone area, staying on the main trails and avoiding any detours into the deeper forest. The work helped calm my nerves and gave me time to process what had happened. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that I'd simply misunderstood what I'd observed. But as I set up camp that night, choosing a site with good visibility in all directions, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. And when the sun went down and the forest sounds began again, I made sure my radio was working and kept my flashlight within easy reach. The sounds came again that night, the same low moaning echoing through the darkness, but farther away this time, as if whatever was making them was keeping its distance. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the impossible vocalizations and wondering what I was really dealing with out here in the wilderness of Isle Royale. 2 days later, I was back at the ranger station, trying to make sense of my patrol report. How do you document an encounter that defies logical explanation? How do you describe sounds that seem to come from empty air and creatures that vanish without a trace? I'd settled on a deliberately vague account. Unusual wildlife sounds observed in the Greenstone area, possible injured animal, requires follow-up investigation. It was honest without being specific enough to raise questions I couldn't answer. The last thing I wanted was to be labeled as the ranger who saw imaginary monsters in the woods. The station was quiet that morning. Most of the other rangers were out on patrol, and the seasonal staff were busy with routine maintenance tasks. I was grateful for the solitude as I worked on my reports, struggling to find the right words to describe events that seemed to have no words. The radio crackled to life just after 10 a.m., breaking the peaceful atmosphere with its urgent static. Isle Royale Base, this is Greenstone Station. We have an emergency situation requiring immediate assistance. I looked up from my paperwork as Tom Carlson, the senior ranger, reached for the radio microphone. The Greenstone Station was a small outpost near the area I'd just patrolled, staffed by a single ranger who monitored the northeastern section of the island. Greenstone Station, this is Isle Royale Base. Go ahead with your situation. Base, we've got multiple injuries here. Civilian casualties from what appears to be a boating accident. 4 people involved, all conscious and responsive, but they're pretty shaken up. We're going to need medical evacuation and probably Coast Guard assistance for the damaged vessels. Tom was already reaching for the emergency protocols manual as he responded. Copy, Greenstone. Can you give us more details on the nature of the injuries and the circumstances of the accident? There was a pause, filled with static, before the voice came back. This time I could hear the uncertainty in the ranger's tone. Base, this is going to sound strange, but the victims are claiming they were chased by some kind of large animal. They say it came out of the forest while they were loading their boats and, well, they were so frightened they crashed into each other trying to get away. Tom and I exchanged glances. Wildlife encounters were common on Isle Royale, but they rarely resulted in boating accidents. The island's moose and wolves generally avoided humans, and bears were occasionally spotted but were typically more interested in food sources than in chasing people. Greenstone, can you get a description of this animal from the witnesses? Another pause. Base, they're pretty adamant that it wasn't a normal animal. They're describing something much larger than a bear or moose, walking on two legs initially, then dropping to all fours. They claim it had a large snout, pronounced teeth, and claws. The witnesses are, well, they're using the term Bigfoot in their statements. I felt my blood turn cold. The description was remarkably similar to what the other rangers had hinted at in their stories about the Greenstone area. More importantly, it suggested that whatever I'd encountered in that clearing might not have been a figment of my imagination. Tom was quiet for a moment, clearly processing this information. Bigfoot reports weren't entirely unknown in the wilderness areas, but they were typically dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes. However, the fact that multiple witnesses were involved, and that they'd been frightened enough to cause actual property damage, meant this couldn't be simply ignored. Copy, Greenstone. We're dispatching assistance immediately. Medical team and investigation crew. ETA, approximately 45 minutes. Tom turned to me as he hung up the microphone. You were just in that area. Did you see or hear anything unusual? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could give the safe answer no, nothing unusual, just normal forest sounds and wildlife sign. Or I could tell the truth about what I'd experienced and risk my credibility as a professional. I heard some strange sounds, I said carefully. Animal vocalizations I couldn't identify, and I thought I saw a large animal in one of the clearings, but I couldn't get a clear look at it. Tom studied my face for a moment, as if trying to read something in my expression. Strange sounds. Care to be more specific? I described the moaning and sputtering sounds I'd heard, being careful to stick to factual observations rather than interpretations. Tom listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more serious as I continued. And this animal you saw? What did it look like? I couldn't tell. It was too far away, partially concealed by tall grass. Large, definitely. Could have been a bear, but the proportions seemed off. When I tried to get a better view, it was gone. Tom nodded slowly. Gone how? Did you see it leave? No, that's the strange part. It just wasn't there anymore. But I could still hear the sounds coming from the same area. For a long moment, Tom said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the large map of the island mounted on the station wall. He studied the Greenstone area, tracing the trail system with his finger. 23 years I've been working this island, he said finally. And in all that time I've heard stories about the Greenstone area that don't make it into official reports. Most of the old-timers have had experiences they can't explain. Sounds that don't match any known wildlife, sightings of large animals that don't behave like normal animals should. He turned back to me. The thing is, we've never had multiple civilian witnesses before. Whatever's happening out there, it's getting bolder. The boat ride to Greenstone took us across increasingly rough water. The weather was deteriorating, with gray clouds building on the horizon and the wind picking up to create 3-foot swells on Lake Superior. Our small flotilla consisted of the medical response boat, a maintenance vessel, and the boat I was riding in with Tom and another ranger. As we approached the accident site, I could see 2 damaged boats pulled up on the rocky shore. One had a significant gash in its fiberglass hull, while the other showed impact damage along its starboard side. Both vessels looked like they'd collided at significant speed, not the kind of damage you'd expect from a careful docking accident. The 4 witnesses were sitting on the shore, wrapped in emergency blankets and being attended to by the medical team. Even from a distance, I could see they were visibly shaken. One man kept looking over his shoulder toward the forest, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. As we pulled our boats up on the rocky beach, the Greenstone station ranger, a young woman named Sarah Mills, approached us with a worried expression. They're all physically okay, some minor cuts and bruises from the collision, but nothing serious, but mentally, they're pretty traumatized. Tom nodded and walked over to the group of witnesses. I followed, pulling out my notebook to document their statements. The 4 people looked like typical tourist middle-aged couples dressed in casual hiking gear, probably on a multi-day backcountry trip. Under normal circumstances, they would have appeared confident and outdoorsy. Now they looked like they'd seen something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the world. The oldest of the group, a heavy-set man in his 50s, was clearly the most affected. His hands were shaking as he accepted a cup of coffee from one of the medical technicians, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that I recognized from my own experience in the clearing. "Can you tell us what happened?" Tom asked gently, settling down on a nearby rock to make the conversation feel less like an interrogation. The man looked at his three companions, as if seeking confirmation that they should share their story. When they nodded encouragingly, he began to speak in a voice that trembled with remembered fear. "We were loading our gear into the boats, getting ready to head back to Rock Harbor. It was about 8:30 this morning, beautiful day, everything normal. Then we heard this sound coming from the forest like someone moaning in pain, but deeper, much deeper." One of the women, a blonde in her 40s, picked up the narrative. "At first we thought it might be someone who was hurt, maybe a hiker who'd had an accident. The sound was so human, but wrong somehow, like someone trying to call for help but not being able to form words properly. We decided to investigate." The second man continued. "Steve and I went toward the tree line while the women stayed with the boats. The sound was getting louder as we approached, coming from somewhere just inside the forest." Steve, the heavy-set man, took a shuddering breath before continuing. "That's when we saw it. This thing emerged from between the trees. At first it was standing upright, like a person, but huge, had to be 7 feet tall, maybe 8, covered in dark hair or fur, with arms that reached almost to the ground. The face," the second woman whispered, and I could see her shudder at the memory. "It had a long snout like a wolf, but the eyes were intelligent, not animal eyes. And the teeth, when it opened its mouth, we could see these massive canine teeth. It looked right at us," Steve continued, his voice growing stronger as he relived the encounter. "Made eye contact, and I swear, it was thinking. Not just reacting like an animal would, but actually thinking about what it was seeing. Then it dropped down on all fours and started moving toward us." The blonde woman nodded vigorously. "That's when we all ran for the boats, but it was faster than anything that size should be able to move. We could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind us, and it was making this horrible sound like growling and laughing at the same time. We got to the boats and just panicked," the second man admitted. "Steve and Linda were in one boat, Janet and I were in the other. We both started our engines at the same time and tried to back away from shore, but we weren't coordinating. Steve's boat came around just as we were backing up and we collided." Steve nodded grimly. "The thing stayed at the edge of the forest, watching us. Even after the collision, when we were dealing with the damage and making sure everyone was okay, it was still there. Just watching, like it was curious about what we'd do next." "How long did it observe you?" Tom asked. "Maybe 10 minutes, Linda replied. Then it turned and walked back into the forest. Not running, not hurrying, just walking away like it had seen enough. That's when we radioed for help. As I listened to their account, I felt a growing certainty that they were describing the same thing I'd encountered. The sounds they described matched exactly what I'd heard in the clearing. The behavior intelligent observation, rather than normal animal reactions, fit with my own experience of feeling watched and studied." Tom was asking follow-up questions, trying to get more specific details about size, coloration, and behavior. The witnesses were consistent in their responses, and there was no sign that they were making up their story or embellishing for effect. They were simply 4 people who'd seen something that shouldn't exist and were trying to make sense of the experience. "Has anyone else reported seeing this creature?" Janet asked. "I mean, this can't be the first time something like this has happened." Tom and I exchanged glances. The official answer was "Nother." Were no documented reports of similar encounters in the area, but the unofficial answer was more complicated. "We occasionally get reports of unusual wildlife activity," Tom said carefully, "but nothing as detailed or from as many witnesses as your account." As the medical team finished their examination and the witnesses prepared to be evacuated to the mainland for further evaluation, I found myself studying the forest where the creature had allegedly appeared. The tree line was thick and impenetrable, offering countless hiding places for something that didn't want to be seen. If there really was a large, unknown animal living in the Greenstone area, the dense forest would provide perfect cover. But questions remained. What kind of animal could survive on an island ecosystem as isolated as Isle Royale? The wolf and moose populations were carefully monitored, and any large predator would have a significant impact on the existing wildlife. There were no reports of unusual predation patterns or disrupted animal behavior that would suggest the presence of something like what the witnesses described. Yet 4 reliable witnesses had seen something, and I'd heard sounds that defied conventional explanation. Either there was a previously unknown animal species living on Isle Royale, or something else was happening that challenged our understanding of what was possible in the natural world. As we loaded the damaged boats for transport back to the main station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something far more complex and potentially dangerous than a simple wildlife encounter. The intelligence the witnesses described, the deliberate nature of the creature's behavior, suggested something that might be actively observing and studying human visitors to the island. The question was, what did it want, and how far was it willing to go to get it? The official incident report took 3 days to complete: 4 civilian witnesses, 2 damaged boats, and claims of an encounter with an unknown large animal. By the time the paperwork was filed and the preliminary investigation closed, the story had taken on a life of its own. Word had leaked to the local media despite our best efforts to keep things quiet. "Bigfoot sighting on Isle Royale," read the headline in the Duluth Tribune, complete with a grainy photograph of the damaged boats and speculation about unknown creatures living in the remote wilderness. The Park Service Public Relations Office was fielding calls from cryptozoology enthusiasts, documentary filmmakers, and curiosity seekers wanting to organize their own expeditions to the Greenstone area. Tom called me into his office on Thursday morning, closing the door behind me before settling into his chair with a weary expression. The past few days had aged him visibly as he dealt with the media attention and pressure from Park Service administrators who wanted the situation contained. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "The regional office is sending a team to investigate these claims. They want a full survey of the Greenstone area, documentation of any unusual animal sign, and a comprehensive report that either confirms or debunks the witnesses' statements." I nodded, understanding the implications. If the investigation found evidence supporting the witnesses' claims, it would open a can of worms that could affect the park's operations for years to come. Scientific teams, media crews, and thrill seekers would descend on the island, disrupting the delicate ecosystem and potentially putting visitors at risk. If the investigation found nothing, the witnesses would be dismissed as either mistaken or dishonest, and the incident would fade into the category of unexplained phenomena that occasionally surfaced in wilderness areas. "Who's leading the investigation?" I asked. "Dr. Marcus Webb from the university's Wildlife Biology Department, along with a team of graduate students and a documentary crew from the local PBS station. They'll be here Monday morning and want to spend a week in the field." Tom leaned back in his chair, studying my face carefully. "I want you to guide them. You know the area better than anyone else on staff, and you were the last ranger to patrol the region before this incident occurred." The assignment made sense from a practical standpoint, but I wasn't sure how I felt about returning to the Greenstone area so soon after my own unexplained encounter. The memory of those sounds and the impossible sight of a creature that vanished while continuing to vocalize was still fresh in my mind. "Have there been any other reports since the incident?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "Nothing official, but Sarah Mills called from the Greenstone station yesterday. She's been hearing unusual sounds at night similar to what you described in your patrol report. Moaning calls that don't match any known wildlife." This was new information, and it reinforced my growing belief that something unusual was indeed happening in the area. Sarah was an experienced ranger with a solid background in wildlife biology. If she was reporting strange sounds, it carried significant weight. "What's your gut feeling about all this?" Tom asked, off the record. I considered my answer carefully. Tom had been straight with me about the unofficial stories surrounding the Greenstone area, and I felt I owed him the same honesty. "I think there's something out there," I said finally. "I don't know what unknown animal species, displaced population of known animals, something else entirely. But the sounds I heard don't match anything in my experience, and 4 reliable witnesses don't just imagine the same detailed encounter." Tom nodded slowly. "That's my feeling too, which makes this investigation both more important and more dangerous than anyone realizes." The weekend passed quietly, giving me time to prepare for the upcoming expedition. I reviewed my patrol notes, studied topographical maps of the Greenstone area, and researched everything I could find about reported sightings of unknown animals in wilderness areas. The literature was surprisingly extensive. Reports of large, unknown primates came from virtually every forested region in North America, with consistency in descriptions that was either remarkable evidence or a remarkably persistent myth. The creature described by the witnesses bipedal but capable of quadrupedal movement, covered in dark hair, with pronounced facial features and evidence of higher intelligence-matched accounts from forests in Washington, British Columbia, and the Appalachian Mountains. What made the Isle Royale situation unique was the isolation. The island was a closed ecosystem where any large animal population would be immediately apparent to researchers who had been studying the wolf and moose populations for decades. If something like what the witnesses described was living on the island, it would either be a recent arrival or something that had managed to remain hidden for generations. Dr. Webb and his team arrived Monday morning on the first ferry, accompanied by enough equipment to stock a small research station. Webb himself was a lean man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His graduate students were eager and well prepared, and the PBS crew was professional but clearly hoping for dramatic footage. I met the group at the dock and helped them load their gear into park service boats for the trip to Greenstone. Webb questioned me closely about my own observations in the area, taking detailed notes and asking for clarification on technical points. It was clear he was taking the investigation seriously rather than treating it as a debunking exercise. "What's your assessment of the witness's credibility?" he asked as we crossed the choppy waters toward the northeastern shore. "High," I replied without hesitation. 4 people with no apparent motive to fabricate a story, consistent accounts despite being interviewed separately, and physical evidence in the form of actual damage to their boats. Whatever they saw, they believed it was real and threatening enough to cause them to panic. Webb nodded, making another note. "Any theories about what they might have encountered?" "Several possibilities. Misidentification of known wildlife. A bear or moose, seen under unusual circumstances, could appear larger and more threatening than normal. Group hysteria, on person's fear infecting the others and creating a shared delusion. Or they saw exactly what they claim they saw," Webb finished. "That's the possibility that bothers me most," I admitted. The trip to Greenstone took 40 minutes, and as we approached the area where the incident had occurred, I found myself scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The shoreline looked peaceful and normal, with no indication that anything unusual had happened there just a week earlier. We established our base camp at the same site where the witnesses had been loading their boats. Webb's team immediately began documenting the area, taking photographs and measurements while searching for any physical evidence the creature might have left behind. The search was methodical and thorough. They found scuff marks in the soft earth near the tree line that could have been made by large feet, but the ground was too disturbed by the rescue operation to provide clear tracks. Several broken branches suggested something large had moved through the underbrush, but again the damage could have been caused by the rescue team or even by normal wildlife. What they did find was more interesting. About 30 yards into the forest, in an area the witnesses claimed the creature had emerged from, Webb's team discovered a series of unusual markings on several trees. The marks were too regular to be natural deep scratches in the bark that formed parallel lines, as if something with large claws had deliberately marked the trees. "These are fresh," Webb said, examining the marks with a magnifying glass. "Made within the past few weeks, possibly days, and they're too high and too deep to have been made by any known animal on the island." The scratches were 7 feet off the ground and extended for nearly a foot down the trunk of each marked tree. They appeared to be territorial markers, similar to what bears sometimes made but far larger and more deliberate in their placement. "Could they have been made by human tools?" one of the graduate students asked. Webb shook his head. "Wrong pattern. These were made by claws or nails, not metal tools. You can see the individual score marks where each digit scraped against the bark." As the team continued their investigation, I found myself drawn back to the clearing where I'd had my own encounter. It was only a mile from the incident site, easily reachable by something moving through the forest. If there really was an unknown animal in the area, it was likely using a network of trails and clearings to move around its territory. I approached Webb with my request to investigate the clearing. "I'd like to show you something," I said, describing my encounter in general terms. "There's another area where I observed unusual activity. It might be connected to what happened here." Webb was immediately interested, and we organized a small expedition to examine the clearing. I led Webb, 2 graduate students, and the PBS camera operator through the forest, following the same trail I'd taken during my patrol. The forest felt different this time. With the security of traveling in a group and the rational presence of scientific investigators, the oppressive atmosphere I'd experienced alone seemed diminished. But it was still there, a sense of watchfulness, of being observed by unseen eyes. When we reached the clearing with the old fire pits, I directed the team to the area where I'd seen the large, dark shape. Webb immediately began examining the ground, looking for any signs of disturbance. "Interesting," he said after several minutes of careful observation. "There's definitely been something large here recently. The grass is flattened in a pattern consistent with a large animal lying down for an extended period." He called over one of his students, who began taking photographs and measurements. The flattened area was roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, large enough for a bear or moose, but the shape was wrong for either animal. "The pattern suggests something that lies on its side rather than curling up like a bear would," Webb explained, "and there are no hoof prints or paw prints in the surrounding soil." As the team worked, I found myself listening for any repetition of the sounds I'd heard during my first visit. The forest was quiet except for normal bird calls and the rustle of wind through leaves. Whatever had been here before was gone or hiding. That's when we heard it. The sound started as a low moan coming from somewhere deep in the forest, exactly like what I'd heard before. The entire team froze, listening as the sound built in intensity and then shifted to that strange, sputtering vocalization. Webb immediately gestured for silence, pulling out a digital recorder and pointing it toward the source of the sound. The PBS camera operator swung his equipment around, trying to capture both the audio and any visual evidence of what might be making the noise. The moaning continued for nearly a minute, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested communication rather than distress. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving the forest in complete silence. "Did anyone see movement?" Webb whispered. We all shook our heads. The sound had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, just as I'd experienced before. Webb played back the recording, and we listened to the strange vocalizations with professional analysis. "I've never heard anything like this," he admitted. "It doesn't match any known North American wildlife. The vocal range suggests something with a large chest cavity and specialized vocal cords." One of the graduate students, a young woman specializing in animal behavior, was studying the audio waveform on a portable spectrograph. "The frequency patterns are fascinating," she said. "There's structure here that suggests intentional communication. This isn't just random noise." As we prepared to leave the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scratches on a tree at the edge of the clearing, identical to the ones we'd found at the incident site. They hadn't been there during my first visit. "Dr. Webb," I called softly, pointing to the marks. He examined them carefully, comparing them to photographs of the earlier markings. Same pattern, same depth, same height. Whatever made these is still active in the area. That night, back at our base camp, Webb called a team meeting to discuss our findings. The evidence was inconclusive but intriguing: unusual markings, strange vocalizations, and witness accounts that were difficult to dismiss. "We need to be extremely careful," Webb said. "If there is an unknown animal in this area, our presence might be seen as a territorial intrusion. Large, intelligent animals can be unpredictable when they feel threatened." As if summoned by his words, the moaning started again, coming from the forest around our camp. This time it was closer, much closer, and seemed to be moving in a slow circle around our position. Webb grabbed his recorder while the camera operator tried to film into the dark forest. But the sound seemed to stay just beyond the reach of our lights, maintaining a careful distance while making it clear that our presence was being monitored. The vocalizations continued for nearly an hour, sometimes close enough that we could hear movement in the underbrush, sometimes so distant they might have been imagined. It was clear that whatever was making the sounds was intelligent enough to stay hidden while conducting its own investigation of our camp. "It's studying us," Webb said quietly, and I could hear both fascination and fear in his voice. "Whatever this thing is, it's curious about human behavior." None of us slept well that night. The breakthrough came on our third day in the field. Dr. Webb had divided his team into 3 groups, each investigating different areas within the creature's apparent territory. I was leading a group that included Webb himself and the PBS camera operator, following a network of game trails that seemed to connect several clearings in the dense forest. We'd been hearing the vocalizations intermittently since dawn, sometimes distant, sometimes close enough to make us stop and scan the underbrush nervously. The pattern was becoming familiar. Long, mournful moans that would build to that strange, sputtering sound, then fade to silence. It was clearly intentional communication, but we still had no idea what was being communicated. The forest itself was showing more signs of the creature's presence. Fresh tree markings appeared daily, always at the same height and with the same claw pattern. Flattened areas in tall grass suggested regular resting spots. And there were trails, not the random paths made by normal wildlife, but deliberate routes that connected key areas with minimal exposure to open spaces. Whatever we were dealing with was intelligent enough to plan its movements and sophisticated enough to avoid detection while remaining aware of our activities. It was becoming clear that we were the subjects of observation as much as we were the observers. The moment of truth came when we reached a clearing we hadn't explored before, deeper in the forest than any of our previous investigations. This one was different, larger than the others, with multiple fire rings that suggested generations of use. But what caught our attention immediately were the bones. They were scattered around the edge of the clearing in carefully arranged piles, not random predation sites but organized collections that showed clear signs of human-like intelligence. The bones were clean and old, bleached white by years of weather. Most appeared to be from deer and other small mammals, but there were larger bones as well, femurs and skulls that suggested moose or possibly bear. "This is a feeding site," Webb said quietly, examining the bone arrangements. "But look at the organization. This isn't natural animal behavior." The bones were sorted by type and size, stacked in neat piles that showed obvious planning and consideration. Some showed evidence of tool mark scratches and breaks that suggested they'd been processed for marrow extraction. It was the kind of organized behavior you'd expect from early human ancestors, not from modern wildlife. As we documented the site, the familiar moaning began again, but this time it was much closer. The sound seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if we were surrounded. Webb immediately signaled for silence, and we crouched among the bone piles, trying to blend into the shadows. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. The creature emerged from the tree line about 50 yards away, moving with a fluid grace that belied its massive size. It was everything the witnesses had described, and more easily 8 feet tall when upright, covered in dark matted hair that looked almost black in the filtered forest light. The face was a disturbing blend of human and animal features, with a pronounced snout but eyes that held unmistakable intelligence. But it wasn't alone. 3 more figures followed the first, smaller but clearly the same species. A family group, moving with coordinated purpose that spoke of complex social organization. They arranged themselves around the clearing's perimeter, effectively cutting off our escape routes while maintaining visual contact with each other. The largest creature, clearly the dominant member of the group, studied us with obvious curiosity. Its posture was relaxed but alert, showing no immediate signs of aggression. It seemed to be evaluating us, trying to understand what we were and what we wanted in its territory. Webb was slowly reaching for his camera, moving with extraordinary care to avoid triggering a defensive response. The PBS operator was already filming, his lens capturing everything despite his obviously shaking hands. The creatures communicated among themselves, using a series of low vocalizations and subtle gestures. Their behavior showed clear evidence of language and not just instinctual calls, but structured communication that conveyed complex information. When one of the smaller individuals started to approach us, the dominant creature made a specific sound that immediately halted the movement. We remained motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. The creatures seemed content to observe us as we observed them, a mutual study that was both fascinating and terrifying. There was no question that these were highly intelligent beings capable of complex thought and social cooperation. Finally, the dominant creature made a series of soft calls, and the group began to withdraw into the forest. But before disappearing completely, it did something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. It looked directly at me, maintaining eye contact for several seconds, then deliberately pointed toward the trail we'd used to enter the clearing. The message was unmistakable: leave, and don't come back. The gesture was so human, so clearly intentional, that it shattered any remaining doubt about what we were dealing with. These weren't just unknown animals, they were a surviving population of something that represented a different branch of human evolution, something that had learned to remain hidden in the remote wilderness areas where modern humans rarely ventured. After the creatures disappeared, we sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour before anyone spoke. Webb was reviewing the footage on his camera, shaking his head in amazement at what we'd captured. "This changes everything," he said finally. "This isn't just a zoological discovery, it's an anthropological revolution. We're looking at evidence of a surviving hominid species that's managed to remain hidden for centuries, possibly millennia." The implications were staggering. If there were multiple family groups living on Isle Royale, there were likely similar populations in other remote wilderness areas. The carefully organized bone sites suggested generations of habitation and cultural development. The complex communication and social structure we'd witnessed indicated intelligence that might rival early human ancestors. But with the discovery came a terrible responsibility. What we'd found was more than a scientific curiosity, it was a living, thinking species that had actively chosen to remain hidden from modern human civilization. Our presence in their territory was clearly an unwelcome intrusion, tolerated only because they were curious about our intentions. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. The debate started immediately and continued for days. Webb was adamant that the discovery needed to be documented and studied, arguing that the scientific value outweighed other considerations. The graduate students were excited about the career-making implications of being involved in such a significant find. The PBS crew was thinking about the documentary that would put them all on the map. But I found myself thinking about that final gesture, the clear message to leave and not return. These creatures had successfully avoided contact with modern humans for generations. They developed a culture and lifestyle that allowed them to survive in harmony with their environment without the destructive impact that human civilization had brought to most of the planet. Did we have the right to expose them to a world that would inevitably want to study, capture, and exploit them? The answer came on our final night in the field. The moaning calls began again after sunset, but this time they were different, more urgent, more insistent. The sounds seemed to be coming from all around our camp, suggesting that multiple groups had gathered in the area. Webb tried to record the vocalizations, but when he turned on his equipment, the sounds stopped immediately. It was clear that the creatures understood the technology and didn't want their communications documented. Then we heard something that made our blood run cold, human speech, distorted and uncertain, but unmistakably an attempt to communicate in our language. "Go away." The words were barely recognizable, formed by vocal cords not designed for human speech, but the meaning was clear. "Leave. Now." The fact that they could attempt human speech, even imperfectly, suggested they'd been listening to and learning from human visitors for years, possibly decades. They understood far more about us than we understood about them. Webb wanted to attempt communication, to try to establish some kind of dialogue, but before he could respond, the calls began again, no longer curious or neutral, but clearly aggressive. The message was being reinforced with increasing urgency. "They want us gone," I said, "and I think we should listen." The decision to leave was difficult for Webb, but the increasing hostility of the vocalizations made it clear that our welcome had been exhausted. We packed up camp and called for evacuation the next morning. During the boat ride back to the main station, Webb and I had a long discussion about what would happen next. The footage was incredible, clear evidence of an unknown hominid species existing in North American wilderness. But releasing it would inevitably lead to expeditions, researchers, media crews, and eventually tourists all descending on Isle Royale. The island's ecosystem, which had existed in careful balance for thousands of years, would be disrupted. The creatures that had successfully remained hidden would be forced into contact with a modern world that might not have their best interests at heart. "What if we're looking at this wrong?" I suggested. "What if the real discovery isn't that these creatures exist, but that they've found a way to live sustainably in harmony with their environment? Maybe the lesson isn't that we need to study them, but that we need to learn from their example and leave them alone." Webb was quiet for a long time, staring out at the waters of Lake Superior. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The footage stays sealed," he said. "We document what we found in our reports, but we classify it as inconclusive. No clear evidence of unknown species, just unexplained phenomena that require further study." It wasn't an easy decision for any of us. The graduate students gave up potential career-making discoveries. The PBS crew shelved what could have been the documentary of a lifetime. and Webb sacrificed what might have been the most significant anthropological find of the century. But it was the right decision. The official report listed our findings as unexplained animal activity in the Greenstone area, possibly related to unusual wolf or bear behavior. The witness statements were filed as wildlife encounter with uncertain identification. The audio recordings were described as unidentified vocalizations, requiring further analysis. None of it was technically false, but none of it revealed the truth about what we'd really discovered. I returned to the Greenstone area one more time before the end of my rotation at Isle Royale. I wanted to see if the creatures were still there, still maintaining their hidden existence in the deep forest. The clearing where we'd made contact was empty, showing no signs of recent use. The bone arrangements had been dismantled and scattered, leaving no evidence of the organized behavior we'd witnessed. It was as if they'd never been there at all. But as I prepared to leave, I heard one final vocalization from the foresta, long, mournful call that might have been a farewell or a warning. The message was clear. They knew I was there, they remembered me, and they were relieved that I was keeping their secret. Even though this was many years ago now, it sticks with me just like it happened last week. I've never spoken publicly about what we really found on Isle Royale, and I never will. Some discoveries are too important to share, and some secrets are worth keeping. The Greenstone area of Isle Royale remains largely unvisited by tourists, protected by its isolation and by the subtle efforts of park rangers who understand that some places are meant to remain wild. The creatures are probably still there, living their ancient lifestyle in harmony with the forest, raising their young and maintaining their culture in ways we can barely imagine. Sometimes I wonder if they remember us, the brief intrusion of modern humans into their hidden world. I hope they do, and I hope they understand that not all of our species would seek to exploit or destroy what we don't understand. But mostly I hope they remain hidden, protected by the vast wilderness of Isle Royale and by the conspiracy of silence maintained by those of us who know the truth. Because in a world where so much wildness has been lost, where so many species have been driven to extinction by human expansion, there's something profoundly hopeful about knowing that somewhere, in the deep forests of a remote island, intelligence and wildness still coexist in perfect balance. The real lesson of the Greenstone encounter isn't about the existence of unknown species. It's about the importance of preserving wilderness spaces where the unexpected can still happen, where mysteries can remain unsolved, and where some truths are worth protecting rather than revealing. That's a lesson I carry with me every day, a reminder that the world still holds wonders beyond our understanding, and that sometimes the greatest act of discovery is knowing when to look away. I have spent 20 years in park and recreational management, currently serving in the National Park Service as a superintendent. The mountains have been my office, my sanctuary, and occasionally my nightmare. What I'm about to share happened during the winter of 2010, stretching into early 2011, an encounter that fundamentally altered my understanding of the wilderness I've devoted my life to protecting. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park spans over 500,000 acres of wilderness, straddling the border between North Carolina and Tennessee. Most visitors experience only a fraction of this territory, sticking to well-maintained trails and popular vistas. But in my position, I ventured into parts of the park that remain virtually untouched by human presence for months, sometimes years at a time. These remote areas harbor secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. That December had been particularly brutal. A series of snowstorms had dumped nearly 3 feet of accumulation at higher elevations, making routine patrols challenging even for seasoned rangers. I had been tracking reports of illegal hunting activity in the far northeastern section of the park, a rugged area with limited access points and almost no winter visitation. "Thompson, you sure about heading up there alone?" Rick Daniels, my deputy superintendent, leaned against my office doorframe on the morning of December 29th. "Weather Service is calling for another 8 inches tonight." I continued packing my gear without looking up. All the more reason to check it now. If someone's poaching up there, the fresh snow will make tracking easier. Besides, I haven't inspected the emergency shelter since the September maintenance run. Rick sighed, knowing better than to argue. "At least take the satellite phone. Cell service is non-existent up there, and with this weather." "Already packed?" I assured him, zipping my backpack closed. "I'll check in at 6 tonight, and again tomorrow morning. If you don't hear from me by noon tomorrow, you can send the cavalry. Just be careful, John. Something feels off about this weather pattern. Reminds me of the winter of '93. I nodded, remembering the blizzard that had stranded 3 hikers for 5 days. We'd found them alive, but barely. I'll be at the rancher cabin tonight and the emergency shelter tomorrow. Both have wood stoves and emergency supplies. I'll be fine. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected. Road crews had cleared the main park roads, but the access road to Hickory Gap was a low priority. By the time I parked my Park Service SUV and strapped on my snowshoes, it was already past noon. The temperature hovered around 23 degrees, but the biting wind made it feel closer to 0. The 4-mile hike to the rancher cabin was uneventful but grueling. Breaking trail through knee-deep snow required more energy than I'd anticipated, and I found myself stopping frequently to catch my breath. The forest was eerily silent, the snow absorbing even the slightest sounds. No birdsong, no scampering squirrels, just the crunch of my snowshoes and the whistle of wind through the naked branches overhead. I reached the rancher cabin shortly before sunset. The small log structure had served as a seasonal ranger outpost since the 1950s, though its origins dated back to the early homesteaders who had lived here before the land became a national park. After clearing the accumulated snow from the entrance, I quickly set about starting a fire in the cast-iron stove. Within an hour, the interior had warmed enough for me to remove my heavy outer layers. After a simple dinner of dehydrated stew, I used the satellite phone to check in with headquarters as promised. Rick answered on the second ring. "Thompson checking in," I said, keeping my voice professional despite my exhaustion. "Made it to the rancher cabin without incident. No signs of disturbance or hunting activity along the main trail." "Good to hear," Rick replied. "Snow started earlier than predicted down here. Already 2 inches in Gatlinburg and coming down hard. How's it looking up there?" I pulled back the cabin's worn gingham curtain to peer outside. Still clear for now, but I can smell it coming. Barometric pressure's dropping fast. "You still planning to push to the emergency shelter tomorrow?" I hesitated. Protocol suggested returning to headquarters if weather conditions deteriorated, but something pulled me toward that remote shelter. In retrospect, I've often wondered how differently things might have turned out had I simply said no. "Affirmative," I finally answered. "I'll make the call in the morning, but plan on me continuing unless it's completely impassable." After ending the call, I reviewed my topographical maps by lantern light, plotting the most efficient route to the emergency shelter. Located 4.5 miles further up the trail, the shelter sat near the convergence of 3 major ridgelines, making it an ideal emergency outpost but difficult to access in winter conditions. The original shelter had burned down in the late 1980s under mysterious circumstances. Park records indicated it had been struck by lightning, but rumors among the older rangers hinted at less natural causes. The replacement structure, built in 1991, was more substantial, a small cabin rather than the 3-sided lean-to typical of most backcountry shelters. Over the past 6 years, however, budget constraints had limited maintenance visits, and I had become the primary caretaker, checking on it at least quarterly. As I settled into my sleeping bag that night, the wind picked up, moaning through the cabin's ancient timbers like a wounded animal. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of dark shapes moving through snow-laden forests, watching me with eyes that reflected no light. I awoke before dawn to absolute silence. The storm had arrived overnight, blanketing the world in another 8 inches of pristine powder. After a quick breakfast and another check-in with headquarters, I shouldered my pack and returned to the trail. The new accumulation made progress even slower than the previous day, and I frequently consulted my GPS to ensure I remained on course. By early afternoon, dark clouds had gathered again, threatening another round of snowfall. I pushed on, determined to reach the shelter before visibility deteriorated further. The trail gradually steepened as it approached the first ridgeline, and I found myself breathing heavily despite decades of experience in mountain terrain. It was there, on that incline, that I first sensed something wasn't right. 20 years in the backcountry teaches you to recognize the normal rhythms of the wilderness and, when those rhythms falter. The forest had grown too quiet, devoid of even the occasional chickadee or nuthatch that typically remained active throughout winter. Something had disrupted the natural order, sending ripples of unease through the ecosystem. I paused, leaning on my trekking poles as I scanned the surrounding forest. Nothing moved among the snow-laden hemlocks and bare deciduous trees, yet the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling the hair at the nape of my neck. I unholstered my service pistol, a precautionary measure I rarely took except when investigating reports of illegal activity. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the snow-muffled landscape. "National Park Service, is anyone there?" Only silence answered, but as I reluctantly continued my ascent, I couldn't shake the conviction that something was following my progress with calculating patience. Something that understood the advantage of allowing prey to exhaust itself before striking. I had left the rancher cabin at first light. I arrived at the emergency shelter by 4 p.m., my muscles aching from the strenuous journey. The small cabin stood in a clearing, partially sheltered by a stand of ancient hemlocks. Fresh snow had drifted against its northern wall, nearly reaching the windowsill. I brushed away the accumulation from the door and stepped inside, relieved to find the interior undisturbed since my last visit. After starting a fire in the small wood stove, I unloaded my gear and began the routine inspection. The emergency supplies remained intact: canned food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency blankets, and a hand crank radio. The structure itself appeared sound, though moisture had begun seeping through one corner of the roof, something to address during the spring maintenance run. With the shelter secured and warming rapidly, I stepped outside to repair my snowshoes, which had developed a loose binding during the final mile of my trek. The afternoon sun had emerged briefly from behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the pristine snow. As I knelt beside the cabin, tools in hand, the tranquility of the moment was shattered by a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It began as a low, guttural growl that quickly rose in pitch and volume until it became a bellowing howl that echoed across the ridgelines. The vocalization continued for nearly a minute, with slight pauses between each outburst. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins as I struggled to identify the source. In 20 years of backcountry work, I had become intimately familiar with the sounds of the forest. I could distinguish between the howls of different wolf packs, recognize individual bears by their vocalizations, and identify most birds by their calls alone. But this was something entirely different. Something wrong. The howl was deeper than any wolf or coyote, with a distorted timbre that suggested a vocal apparatus unlike anything native to these mountains. It carried none of the melodic quality of an elk bugle or the defensive bluster of a black bear. Instead, it seemed deliberately territorial, a warning that penetrated to the primitive part of my brain, triggering instincts far older than rational thought. As the final echoes faded into the gathering dusk, I found myself faced with a decision that would alter the course of my life. Protocol dictated reporting unusual wildlife encounters without engaging, particularly when alone in remote areas. The sensible choice was to secure the shelter, document my observations, and return to headquarters the following morning. Instead, I reached for my pack. The rational part of my mind screamed in protest as I checked my service pistol, secured my snowshoes, and gathered essential survival gear. 20 years of training and experience urged caution, reminded me of protocols established for good reasons. But another part, a deeper, more primitive aspect of my consciousness, demanded investigation. This was my territory, my responsibility. Whatever had made that sound was an unknown variable in an ecosystem I had sworn to protect and understand. I locked the shelter behind me, leaving my non-essential gear inside. The temperature was dropping rapidly as the brief afternoon sun retreated behind the mountains. I estimated no more than 2 hours of daylight remained sufficient time to investigate the source of the vocalization and return before full darkness, assuming I moved quickly. The howl had originated from the northwest, somewhere along the higher ridgeline that formed the watershed boundary between two major drainages. I oriented myself using landmarks and my compass, then began the steep ascent through increasingly dense undergrowth. The snow here was shallower due to the tree cover, making progress slightly faster than on the exposed trail. As I climbed, the forest changed character. The well-spaced hemlocks and hardwoods of the lower slopes gave way to a twisted maze of mountain laurel and rhododendron, their waxy leaves drooping under the weight of accumulated snow and ice. These hells, as local hunters called them, created natural barriers that few hikers ever penetrated, preserving pockets of wilderness that remained essentially pristine. I had covered perhaps 3/4 of a mile, approaching the crest of the first ridge, when I noticed the first anomaly. A swath of disturbed snow extended across my path, as though something large had been dragged across the ground. Following the disturbance a few yards off trail, I discovered the first carcass. The white-tailed doe lay on her side, partially concealed by a thicket of rhododendron. At first glance, the scene suggested a typical predator kill until I looked closer. The animal's throat had been torn open with shocking violence, exposing the cervical vertebrae. More disturbing was the absence of the head, which appeared to have been wrenched entirely from the body. Yet despite this catastrophic damage, there were no visible bite marks or claw patterns consistent with known predators. No feeding had occurred. The kill appeared to be an act of territorial assertion rather than predation for sustenance. I photographed the carcass from multiple angles, using my pocket knife for scale. The lack of blood saturation in the surrounding snow suggested the kill had occurred elsewhere, with the carcass subsequently relocated to this position. But why would any predator expend energy moving prey without feeding? As I continued my documentation, I discovered 2 more deer carcasses within a 50-yard radius, each displaying the same pattern of mutilation. All were relatively fresh, probably killed within the past 24-48 hours based on the minimal decomposition despite the cold temperatures. All 3 were does, ranging from yearlings to mature adults. None showed evidence of being consumed. I was completing my examination of the 3rd carcass when the howl came again closer this time, and if possible, even more powerful. The sound reverberated through the gathering darkness, setting my nerves on edge and sending a cold shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Professional curiosity warred with primal fear as I calculated my next move. The sensible action would be immediate retreat to the emergency shelter. But I had come this far, and the ridgetop was tantalizingly close, offering a potential vantage point to observe whatever was producing those sounds. I checked my watch less than an hour of usable light remained. Enough time to reach the ridge and make observations, but leaving little margin for the return journey. I would need to move quickly and remain vigilant. The final approach to the ridgetop proved more challenging than anticipated. What appeared from below to be a gentle slope revealed itself as a series of natural terraces separated by near-vertical rock faces. I was forced to navigate carefully, searching for viable routes between the weathered sandstone outcroppings. As I neared the summit, the howling resumed, now seemingly continuous. The vocalizations came in measured intervals, each lasting approximately 15 seconds with brief pauses between. The pattern suggested territorial marking rather than hunting communication, consistent with the ritualistic nature of the kills I had documented. The sound drew me forward like a physical force, compelling me toward the ridgetop despite the growing knot of dread in my stomach. I moved with increasing caution, testing each foothold before committing my weight, conscious that a sprained ankle or worse would leave me desperately vulnerable. Finally, I crested the ridge and found myself at the edge of a small alpine meadow, perhaps 100 yards across at its widest point. The clearing was ringed by stunted spruce and fir trees, their branches heavy with snow. From this vantage point, I could see for miles across the undulating landscape of the Smokies, ridge after ridge receding into the blue haze that gave the mountains their name. The howling had stopped abruptly with my arrival, replaced by an oppressive silence. I scanned the meadow methodically, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance in the pristine snow. For several minutes I detected nothing unusual. Then I saw it. On the far side of the meadow, partially obscured by the lengthening shadows, stood a figure that defied rational categorization. My first, desperate attempt to make sense of the sight led me to classify it as a mountain lion, but that identification collapsed immediately under the weight of observed reality. The creature stood motionless, oriented at roughly a 45-degree angle to my position, providing a clear view of its front quarters. Its general configuration was vaguely feline, with a powerful, muscular build that suggested the proportions of a large, big cat. But the similarities ended there. The animal's coat displayed a distinctive brindle pattern alternating stripes of tawny gold and deep russet unlike anything documented in North American wildlife. More unsettling was the pronounced mane that encircled its neck and shoulders, reminiscent of an African lion but darker and more extensive, almost merging with the creature's body fur rather than standing distinct. Its size alone defied explanation. I estimated its shoulder height at nearly 4 feet, significantly larger than even the largest documented mountain lions. Its head god helpmate's head was all wrong. The proportions seemed distorted, the skull elongated in a way that suggested something almost simian merged with feline features. The eyes, though difficult to discern at that distance, appeared to be set more forward than a typical cat's, suggesting the binocular vision of a predator but with an unsettling hint of higher consciousness. I stood transfixed, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. My scientific training battled with the evidence before my eyes, searching desperately for rational explanations. A previously undocumented species, a severe mutation or deformity, some bizarre hybrid. Each possibility seemed more unlikely than the last. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The creature remained perfectly still, giving no indication that it had detected my presence despite my exposed position on the ridgetop. I realized I had been holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. In that moment, standing on the precipice between the known and the impossible, a strange calm settled over me. I had ventured into the wilderness thousands of times over my career, encountering everything from aggressive bears to armed poachers. I had always relied on my training, my knowledge, and my connection to the natural world. But here, facing something that existed outside the boundaries of my understanding, I felt those foundations crumble. I reached slowly for my camera, determined to document what I was seeing, to transform this impossible encounter into something tangible and verifiable. But as my fingers closed around the device, the spell was broken. The creature's head snapped toward me with unnatural speed, its attention suddenly and completely focused on my position. Though I couldn't discern its eyes clearly at that distance, I felt its gaze lock onto me with predatory intensity. A low, rumbling growl carried across the meadow, raising the hair on my arms despite my layers of winter clothing. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was being assessed as prey. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously as I stood frozen under the creature's gaze. My hand remained on my camera, but I no longer entertained thoughts of documentation. Instead, my focus narrowed to the service pistol holstered at my hip, a 9mm Glock that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. The rational part of my mind calculated distances and probabilities. The creature was perhaps 75 yards away across open ground. Even a peak-condition mountain lion could cover that distance in seconds. If this thing was comparably fast and its physiology suggested it might be faster, I would have minimal time to react if it charged. The shelter was 3/4 of a mile back down the ridge, impossible distance to cover before being overtaken if the creature pursued. My only realistic option was to stand my ground and hope that my presence was sufficient deterrent to an attack. Many predators, even apex hunters like grizzlies, will avoid confrontation with humans unless threatened or desperately hungry. But as I watched the creature, I became increasingly convinced that I was dealing with something outside the normal parameters of predator behavior. The mutilated deer carcasses suggested killing for reasons beyond sustenance. The positioning of the bodies indicated territorial marking. This wasn't just a predator, it was something establishing dominance. And I had just wandered into its claimed territory. For what seemed like an eternity but was likely only 30 to 45 seconds, we remained locked in this standoff. The creature made no move to approach, but neither did it retreat or show signs of intimidation. Its posture remained neutral, almost contemplative, as though it were making complex calculations about my presence. That was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the encounter, the sense of intelligence behind those eyes, not the instinctive cunning of a natural predator, but something more deliberate and evaluative, something that processed information in ways that seemed almost human. The thought had barely formed when the tableau was suddenly disrupted. From the trees behind me came the sound of movement, rapid, desperate. I risked a glance over my shoulder to see 2 white-tailed deer, a doe and a yearling, burst from the forest edge and bound across the ridgetop, their terror evident in their wide eyes and heaving flanks. They passed within 20 yards of my position, apparently oblivious to my presence in their panic to escape something else. When I turned back toward the creature, everything had changed. It was in motion now, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. But instead of pursuing the dearth natural prey that had just presented itself, it was angling toward me with deliberate purpose. My training took over. I drew my service pistol and assumed a firing stance, though I held my fire. Park Service protocol dictated that lethal force against wildlife was authorized only in immediate defense of human life. Despite the creature's approach, it had not yet demonstrated clear, aggressive intent. "Hey," I shouted, employing the aggressive vocalization techniques taught for deterring predators. "Back off, get out of here." The creature paused momentarily at my shout, its head tilting slightly as though processing this new information. Then it resumed its approach, its pace unhurried but purposeful. It moved with an unsettling gait, not quite the bound of a big cat, nor the loping run of a wolf, but something in between. Its massive shoulders rolled beneath the brindled fur, and its head remained fixed on me with unnerving focus. As it closed to within 50 yards, I could see details that had been obscured by distance. Its face was a nightmare amalgamation of feline and almost anthropomorphic features. The muzzle was shorter than a typical mountain lion's, the jaw more articulated. The eyes, God help me, the eyes were amber with vertical pupils, but larger and set more forward in the skull, conveying an intelligence that sent ice through my veins. "Last warning," I called out, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Stop right there." The creature halted again, now close enough that I could see its chest expand with each breath. Its tail, longer than proportional for a mountain lion, twitched methodically from side to side. Then, in a gesture that nearly stopped my heart, it sat back on its haunches in an almost contemplative posture. For several seconds, it simply observed me from this seated position, head slightly cocked to one side. Then it opened its mouth, revealing teeth that seemed designed for tearing rather than crushing, longer and more curved than typical feline dentition. But it wasn't preparing to roar or growl. Instead, it appeared to be tasting the air, drawing my scent across specialized olfactory organs in its mouth in a behavior reminiscent of a snake's phlegm response. The analytical part of my mind noted these details even as the primal part screamed for immediate retreat. I had encountered hundreds of predators throughout my career: bears, wolves, cougars, even the occasional alligator in the southern parks where I'd previously worked. None had ever behaved like this. None had ever demonstrated this unsettling combination of predatory focus and apparent analytical assessment. My finger tensed on the trigger as the creature lowered its front quarters slightly, a posture that often preceded a pounce in big cats. I had perhaps seconds to decide whether to fire, knowing that a missed shot or non-lethal hit would likely trigger an immediate attack. The decision was made for me when a distant crack echoed across the ridge, a tree branch breaking under the weight of accumulated snow somewhere in the forest below. The sound was slight, but it broke the hypnotic standoff between us. The creature's head whipped toward the source of the noise, its muscles tensing visibly beneath its brindled coat. In that moment of distraction, self-preservation finally overcame curiosity. I began backing slowly toward the forest edge, maintaining my aim on the creature but desperate to reach cover. My movement recaptured its attention, its head swiveling back toward me with unnatural speed. For a heartbeat, I thought it would charge. Its muscles bunched, and a low growl emanated from deep in its chest. But instead of attacking, it rose from its haunched position and began pacing laterally, maintaining its distance but moving to intercept my path to the forest. It was hurting me. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through me. This wasn't just predatory behavior, it was tactical. The creature was deliberately cutting off my escape route, demonstrating not just hunting instinct but strategic thinking. I altered my course, angling away from the creature's position while continuing to back toward the tree line. It matched my movement precisely, maintaining the same relative position between us. The message was clear. It was controlling this encounter, not me. As I approached the forest edge, approximately 40 yards from my original position, the standoff reached its climax. The creature halted its lateral movement and turned to face me directly. Then, in a display that defied explanation, it reared up briefly on its hind legs, reaching a height that I estimated at over 7 feet. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I understood about natural wildlife, that I nearly pulled the trigger in reflexive terror. The creature balanced in this bipedal posture for only a moment before dropping back to all fours, but the image burned itself indelibly into my memory: the elongated torso, the almost articulated shoulders, the hands, not paws but hands, with visible digits that flexed and grasped at the air. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the confrontation ended. The creature turned and loped away across the meadow, moving with astonishing speed despite its size. It reached the far tree line within seconds and disappeared into the gathering darkness of the forest. I remained frozen in place, pistol still raised, for nearly a minute after it vanished. Only when my arms began to tremble from the extended firing position did I finally lower the weapon, though I kept it unholstered as I backed into the protective cover of the trees. Once within the forest, I turned and began moving as quickly as safety allowed back down the ridge toward the emergency shelter. The fading light cast long shadows through the trees, transforming familiar shapes into menacing silhouettes. Every snapping twig or rustle of branches sent adrenaline coursing through my system anew. I had covered perhaps 100 yards when I heard it again, the bellowing howl that had first drawn me to the ridge. But this time it wasn't a distant sound. It was directly behind me, emanating from the vicinity of the meadow I had just left. The vocalization continued for nearly a minute, rising and falling in that distinctive pattern I had noted earlier. The message couldn't have been clearer. I was being allowed to leave. The thought propelled me forward with renewed urgency. I abandoned any pretense of scientific observation or professional detachment. In that moment, I was nothing more than prey that had been granted a temporary reprieve, and I had no intention of squandering it. I descended the ridge with reckless speed, sacrificing caution for distance. Branches whipped at my face as I half ran, half slid down the steep incline, using tree trunks to control my momentum when the gradient became too severe. My headlamp bounced erratically, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. More than once, I caught myself before pitching headlong down precipitous drops that would have resulted in serious injury or worse. The temperature continued to plummet as full darkness enveloped the forest. My breath crystallized in front of my face, and sweat from exertion froze against my skin beneath multiple layers of clothing. Despite the cold, I pushed onward, driven by the conviction that maximum distance was my only true security. As I neared the location of the mutilated deer carcasses, I slowed momentarily, scanning the surrounding forest with my headlamp. The scene had changed. Where 3 bodies had been clearly visible during my ascent, now only disturbed snow and drag marks remained. Something had removed the carcasses during the brief time I had spent on the ridge. The implications sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my system. Either the creature I had encountered had returned to claim its kills with astonishing speed, or there was more than one of them in these woods. Neither possibility offered comfort. I redoubled my pace, no longer even attempting to move quietly. The crash of my passage through the underbrush echoed through the silent forest, but I no longer cared about maintaining stealth. My only objective was reaching the relative safety of the emergency shelter before whatever stalked these ridges decided to reconsider its earlier restraint. After what seemed like hours but was likely less than 45 minutes, I emerged from the densest part of the forest and spotted the shelter approximately 200 yards ahead. The small cabin appeared unbearably vulnerable in the vast wilderness, its single window glowing with the faint light of the fire I had left burning in the wood stove. I covered the final distance at a sprint, stumbling more than once in the deep snow but regaining my footing through sheer determination. Reaching the door, I fumbled with frozen fingers at the simple latch, finally wrenching it open and practically falling inside. I slammed the door behind me and secured both the primary lock and the secondary deadbolt that had been installed after the rebuilding. Only then, within the relative security of solid walls, did I allow myself to process what I had experienced. My hands trembled violently as I added wood to the dwindling fire, and my breathing came in ragged gasps that had little to do with physical exertion. I checked my watch, barely 5:30 p.m. The entire encounter had lasted less than 90 minutes, yet it had fundamentally altered my perception of the wilderness I had dedicated my life to protecting. Protocol demanded I report the incident immediately via satellite phone. Unusual wildlife encounters, especially those involving potentially dangerous animals, required documentation and potentially a management response if public safety was at risk. But as I reached for the phone, I hesitated. What exactly would I report? That I had encountered an unidentified creature resembling a grotesquely distorted mountain lion with near-human characteristics. That this creature had displayed intelligence and behavior patterns outside the documented parameters of any known North American wildlife. That it had stood on its hind legs like a person. The report would trigger an immediate investigation. Teams would be dispatched to the area, potentially placing others at risk. My professional reputation, built meticulously over 2 decades of service, would be scrutinized. Without photographic evidence which I had failed to obtain in the moment of confrontation, my account would likely be dismissed as the product of stress, isolation, or worse. I set the satellite phone down and moved to the small window, peering out into the darkness. The snow had begun falling again, large flakes drifting lazily in the beam of my flashlight. The forest beyond the small clearing appeared impenetrable, a wall of shadows that could conceal anything or nothing at all. Had I actually seen what I thought I saw? Could exhaustion, combined with the challenging conditions and fading light, have distorted my perception of a normal mountain lion? The possibility offered temporary comfort, a rational explanation that would allow me to maintain my understanding of the world and my place in it. But then I remembered the deer carcasses, their systematic mutilation, the missing heads, the lack of feeding behavior. I remembered the creature's deliberate movements as it attempted to herd me away from my escape route. Most of all, I remembered those eyes, intelligent, calculating, aware in a way that transcended animal consciousness. No, I hadn't imagined it. Whatever I had encountered on that ridge existed outside the boundaries of conventional biology, a living anomaly in a wilderness I had foolishly believed held no more secrets from me. I secured the shutters over the window and methodically checked every potential entry point to the shelter, reinforcing the door with the small wooden table normally used for meal preparation. Once satisfied that the shelter was as secure as possible, I retrieved my service pistol and placed it on the small shelf beside my sleeping bag, within immediate reach. Sleep was out of the question. I maintained the fire at maximum intensity, creating an oasis of warmth and light against the encroaching darkness. Every creak of the shelter's timbers, every whistle of wind through the eaves, triggered a fresh surge of vigilance. I found myself straining to detect the distinctive howl that had first led me to the ridge, both dreading and expecting its return. Around 9:30 p.m., as I sat rigid with tension beside the fire, the satellite phone chirped the scheduled check-in from headquarters. I considered ignoring it, uncertain if I could maintain composure during a conversation. But failure to respond would trigger emergency protocols, potentially putting others at risk unnecessarily. I answered on the third ring. "Thompson here," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "John, it's Rick. Just checking in as scheduled. Everything all right up there? Weather's turned nasty down here." I hesitated, the truth hovering on the edge of my tongue. Then I swallowed it back. "All secure at the emergency shelter. Storm's intensifying, but the structure is sound. How bad is it in the valley?" 8 inches already and no sign of letting up. Road crews are struggling to keep the main arteries clear. If this keeps up, extraction tomorrow might be challenging. The prospect of remaining in the backcountry for additional nights sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Understood. I'll prepare for potential extended stay, but will attempt to return as planned. "You sure everything's okay, John? You sound off." I forced a dry chuckle. "Just tired. Breaking trail through fresh powder takes more out of me than it used to. Getting old, I guess." "Aren't we all?" Rick replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Get some rest. Check in again at 700 tomorrow, earlier if conditions deteriorate." "Will do," I confirmed, ending the call before my resolve crumbled. Alone again, I resumed my vigil. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness, marked only by the gradual consumption of the shelter's limited firewood supply and the occasional need to clear accumulated snow from the small chimney pipe. By 2 a.m., exhaustion had begun to overcome even the most determined vigilance, and I found myself drifting into microsleeps despite my best efforts to remain alert. It was during one of these momentary lapses that I heard a soft scraping against the exterior wall of the shelter. My eyes snapped open, hand automatically reaching for the pistol as I oriented myself in the dimly lit interior. The sound came again, more distinct this time, not the random patter of snow or ice falling from the trees, but a deliberate, methodical movement along the shelter's northern wall. Something was circling the structure, testing its perimeter. I rose silently, pistol gripped in both hands, and moved to the window. The shutters remained secured, but a small gap between the panels allowed limited visibility into the clearing. The snowfall had intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond the shelter. I strained to penetrate the swirling whiteness, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. For several minutes I detected nothing unusual. Then, just as I began to question whether I had imagined the sounds, a shadow detached itself from the tree line approximately 30 yards from the shelter. The figure moved with the same fluid grace I had witnessed on the ridge, its brindled coat barely visible against the swirling snow. It was here. It had followed me. My grip tightened on the pistol as the creature paused at the edge of the clearing, its attention fixed unmistakably on the shelter. Despite the distance and poor visibility, I felt the weight of its gaze as tangibly as a physical touch. It remained motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, then began a deliberate circuit of the clearing, maintaining the same distance from the shelter but examining it from all angles. Testing for weaknesses, developing a strategy. The behavior was so calculated, so fundamentally unanimal-like, that I found myself questioning my own sanity. Predators might stalk prey to a structure and wait for emergence, but this methodical assessment of a human habitation suggested a level of cognition that defied classification. After completing its circuit, the creature returned to its original position at the edge of the tree line. Then, in a display that froze the blood in my veins, it rose again to its hind legs, balancing in that uncanny bipedal posture. From this position, it extended one forelimb bone hand toward the shelter in what appeared to be a deliberate pointing gesture. The message couldn't have been clearer. I see you. I know you're in there. Then it dropped back to all fours and, with one final look toward the shelter, melted back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. I remained at the window for hours afterward, pistol trained on the tree line, expecting the creature's return at any moment. But the forest remained still, save for the endless cascade of snowflakes. By dawn, nearly 18 inches of fresh powder had accumulated, transforming the landscape into an unbroken expanse of white. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the shutters, I forced myself to face the decision that had been forming in my mind throughout the long night. The storm had created a temporary sanctuary, the deep snow, a natural barrier to most predators, but it also made my planned return to headquarters nearly impossible without assistance. I had two options: remain at the shelter and hope for rescue once the storm abated, or attempt the journey back to the rancher cabin and potentially beyond, depending on conditions. Neither prospect appealed, but inaction felt increasingly untenable. The creature knew my location. It had demonstrated patience and intelligence. Remaining static was simply awaiting its convenience. At 7 a.m., I made the scheduled check-in call. "Thompson reporting," I said when Rick answered. "Requesting extraction assistance as soon as conditions permit." "Situation?" Rick asked, immediately alert to the tension in my voice. I hesitated, then opted for partial truth. "Observed unusual predator activity in the vicinity of the emergency shelter. Potentially dangerous wildlife. Behavior suggests territorial aggression." "Cougar?" "Unconfirmed species," I replied carefully. "Larger than typical mountain lion. Unusual coloration and behavior patterns." There was a pause on the line. "You think it might be one of the escaped exotic cats from that private zoo in North Carolina, the one that got shut down last year?" The suggestion offered a lifeline, a rational explanation that wouldn't immediately mark me as unstable. "Possibly. Didn't get clear enough visuals for positive ID." "Understood. We've got blizzard conditions down here, John. Roads are completely snowed in, and visibility's too poor for helicopter extraction. Earliest we could get a team to you would be tomorrow, assuming the forecast improvement materializes." "Understood," I replied, trying to keep the disappointment from my voice. "I'll maintain position and continue monitoring. Has there been any other unusual wildlife activity reported in the park?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. Few visitors with the weather, and most of our patrols are focused on keeping roads clear. You're the only one crazy enough to be up in the high country right now." He paused. "You sure you're okay, John? You don't sound like yourself." "Just tired," I assured him. "Long night. The wind was fierce up here." "All right. Maintain regular check-ins every 4 hours until extraction, and John didn't take unnecessary risks with unidentified wildlife. Park policy is clear on that." "Roger that," I confirmed, ending the call. I spent the remainder of the morning inventorying the shelter's supplies and preparing for potential confrontation. The emergency cache included a marine flare gun with 3 cartridges, not lethal but potentially effective as a deterrent. I loaded it and kept it alongside my service pistol. I fashioned additional barriers for the door and windows using the shelter's limited furniture and equipment, creating multiple layers of obstruction that would provide warning of any breach attempt. As midday approached with no further sign of the creature, my exhaustion finally overcame vigilance. I allowed myself to doze in short intervals, never more than 15 minutes at a time, pistol in hand even in sleep. These brief respites did little to restore my energy but prevented complete collapse. The day passed with excruciating slowness, marked only by the gradual improvement in weather conditions as the storm system moved eastward. By late afternoon, the snowfall had diminished to occasional flurries, and visibility had improved significantly. Through the small window, I could see the surrounding forest with greater clarity, confirming that, for the moment at least, no immediate threat lurked in the vicinity of the shelter. The scheduled 4 p.m. check-in brought cautiously optimistic news from headquarters. Road crews had made significant progress clearing the main park arteries, and if conditions continued to improve, an extraction team could potentially reach the rancher cabin by mid-morning the following day. From there, they would assess conditions for proceeding to the emergency shelter. "Can you make it back to the rancher cabin if necessary?" Rick asked. I considered the question carefully. The 4.5 miles separating the emergency shelter from the rancher cabin would be challenging but not impossible in the improved conditions. Moving would expose me to potential encounter, but it would also place me closer to extraction and support. "Affirmative," I finally replied. "I can depart at first light, reach the rancher cabin by mid-morning if conditions hold." "Do it," Rick instructed. "Safer to have you moving toward us than waiting for us to reach you, especially with this potential predator situation. We'll have a team at the rancher cabin by 1,100 hours." "Understood. We'll confirm departure at first light." The decision made, I set about preparing for the journey. I packed only essentials: water, emergency rations, first aid supplies, extra ammunition, and minimal survival gear. Everything else would remain at the shelter, reducing weight to maximize mobility. I laid out my clothing in precise order for rapid dressing, set an alarm for 30 minutes before dawn, and forced myself to attempt more substantial rest to prepare for the arduous journey ahead. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares in which I found myself pursued through endless forests by a shape that was neither fully animal nor fully human. Each time I woke, I checked and rechecked the shelter's security measures, irrationally certain that each dream had been prophetic rather than reflective. The final hours of darkness stretched interminably, but eventually, the alarm signaled the approach of dawn. I dressed quickly, secured my pack, and performed a final check of my weapons. The service pistol was holstered at my hip, while the flare gun was positioned for immediate access in my jacket's outer pocket. I had decided on a route that would follow natural clearings where possible, avoiding the densest forest cover that could conceal an ambush. At the scheduled time, I made my final check-in from the shelter. "Thompson reporting. Preparing to depart emergency shelter for rancher cabin as instructed." "Confirmed," Rick replied. "Team is assembled and departing headquarters now. ETA to rancher cabin approximately 1,030 hours. Weather conditions are favorable, visibility good." "Any further sign of the predator?" "Negative," I reported, omitting the nighttime visitation. "No visual contact since initial observation." "Good. Maintain regular radio contact during transit. Check in every 30 minutes or immediately if you observe any unusual activity." "Understood. Thompson out." I secured the satellite phone, took a deep breath, and opened the shelter door to face whatever awaited me in the winter wilderness. The pre-dawn forest greeted me with eerie silence. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white broken only by the dark verticals of tree trunks. The temperature had moderated slightly, hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit cold but manageable with proper equipment and movement. I secured the shelter behind me, more from habit than any practical purpose, and began breaking trail toward the rancher cabin. The fresh powder was deep but relatively light, allowing reasonable progress despite the accumulation. I maintained a steady pace, focusing on efficient movement rather than speed, conscious that the journey would require sustained effort over several hours. The forest gradually awakened around me as dawn broke. Chickadees and nuthatches resumed their foraging activities, flitting between snow-laden branches with characteristic energy. A red squirrel chattered indignantly as I passed its territory, and I spotted deer tracks crossing my path, signs of normal wildlife activity that provided some reassurance. My first scheduled check-in at 30 minutes from departure was uneventful. I reported my position and confirmed continued absence of the unidentified predator. Rick acknowledged and reminded me to maintain vigilance, his concern evident despite the professional tone. I had covered approximately a mile when I first noticed the anomaly. The natural sounds of the forest bird calls, squirrel chatter, the occasional snap of a branch releasing its burden of snow had gradually diminished, creating a pocket of silence that followed my progress. The wildlife was responding to something, sensing a presence that I could not yet detect. I halted, removing my pack and retrieving my binoculars. Methodically, I scanned the surrounding forest, searching for any sign of movement or disturbance. The terrain here was moderately steep, with good visibility between the predominantly deciduous trees that had shed their leaves months earlier. If something was following me, it would need to use the scattered evergreens or topographical features for concealment. For several minutes I detected nothing unusual. Then, as I began to lower the binoculars, a flash of movement caught my attention approximately 200 yards upslope. I refocused quickly, steadying the binoculars against a tree trunk to eliminate hand tremor. There, moving parallel to my route but maintaining elevation advantage, was the creature. It was using a series of rock outcroppings for cover, revealing itself only momentarily as it transitioned between positions. The glimpses were brief but unmistakable: the brindled coat, the distinctive mane, the fluid movement that combined feline grace with something altogether different. It was tracking me, not pursuing, not yet, but maintaining visual contact while remaining just beyond effective range of my service weapon. The behavior suggested not just predatory instinct but tactical understanding. It was controlling the engagement distance, using terrain to advantage, demonstrating principles of pursuit-predation adapted to an armed quarry. I returned the binoculars to my pack and retrieved the satellite phone, keeping my movements deliberate and unhurried despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Thompson reporting unscheduled contact," I said when Rick answered. "Visual confirmation of unidentified predator, approximately 200 yards upslope from my position. Animal is tracking my movement but maintaining distance." "Can you provide more detailed description?" Rick asked, his voice tense. I hesitated, then committed to honesty, whatever the consequences. Large felled, significantly larger than typical mountain lion, distinctive brindle coat pattern and pronounced mane. Movement patterns and tracking behavior suggest high intelligence. Recommend extreme caution during extraction operation. There was a pause on the line. "John, are you absolutely certain this isn't a standard mountain lion? Winter coat can sometimes create the appearance of a mane, and unusual coloration has been documented in isolated populations." "Negative," I replied firmly. "This is not a standard mountain lion. I've encountered dozens throughout my career. This is something else." Another pause. "Understood. Continue toward extraction point. Team has been notified of potential dangerous wildlife encounter. They're armed and prepared for contingencies. Your current location?" I provided coordinates from my GPS, confirming I had covered approximately 1 mile from the emergency shelter, with 3.5 miles remaining to the rancher cabin. "Roger that. Continue movement. Maintain vigilance. Check in immediately if situation changes." I secured the phone and resumed my trek, now hyper-aware of the presence shadowing my progress. The creature maintained its parallel course, occasionally visible through the trees but never presenting a clear target or approaching closer than its initial position. It was escorting me, ensuring my departure from its territory rather than pursuing me as prey, behavior that again defied conventional wildlife management understanding. The next 2 miles passed in this tense equilibrium, the creature maintaining its watchful presence while I continued steadily toward the extraction point. With each check-in, I reported its continued observation, trying to convey the significance of its behavior patterns without sounding irrational or panicked. As I approached the final mile before the rancher cabin, the landscape changed character. The relatively open forest gave way to a section of dense rhododendron and mountain laurel thickets, the laurel hells, that created natural barriers throughout the Smokies. The trail narrowed here, forcing passage through a corridor of vegetation that severely limited visibility and maneuverability. I paused at the entrance to this natural bottleneck, instinctively wary. The tactical disadvantage was obvious: the dense vegetation would conceal the creature's approach until it was potentially within striking distance, while the narrow trail would restrict my movement and sight lines for effective defense. I considered alternatives, evaluating possible routes that would bypass the thicket. But the surrounding terrain offered no viable options without significant detour. The extraction team was already en route to the rancher cabin, expecting my arrival within the hour. Deviating from the planned route would complicate coordination and potentially lead to missed connections. The decision point was forced when I spotted movement again, this time much closer, perhaps 100 yards behind my position. The creature had abandoned its parallel tracking and was now following directly on my trail, closing the distance with deliberate purpose. I had no choice but to proceed through the thicket, maintaining maximum possible speed while remaining alert for ambush. I drew my service pistol, holding it at the ready position as I entered the vegetative tunnel. The trail wound through the rhododendrons in a series of sharp bends, rarely providing visibility more than 15 or 20 feet ahead or behind. My progress slowed considerably as I navigated the dense growth, constantly checking over my shoulder for signs of pursuit. The silence was absolute, save for my own labored breathing and the occasional scrape of my pack against overhanging branches. Even the birds had abandoned this section of forest, as though sensing the tension playing out beneath their usual domain. I had covered perhaps 200 yards into the thicket when I heard a soft displacement of snow somewhere behind me, distinct from the random falls of accumulated precipitation from the branches overhead. Something was following my path through the laurel hell, moving with far greater stealth than my own clumsy human passage. I increased my pace to the maximum possible without sacrificing awareness, conscious that the rancher cabin lay less than half a mile beyond the far side of the thicket. The extraction team might already be there, representing safety and reinforcement if I could just reach them in time. The path ahead bent sharply around a particularly dense cluster of rhododendron, temporarily blocking all forward visibility. As I rounded the corner, I came to an abrupt halt, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. The trail ahead was blocked, not by fallen trees or natural obstacles, but by deer carcasses, arranged deliberately across the narrow path. 3 does, displayed in the same manner as those I had discovered near the ridgenecks, wrenched open, heads missing, bodies unmolested otherwise. The snow beneath them was stained crimson, the only color in the monochromatic winter landscape. This was no random predator behavior. This was communication, a warning as clear as any human signage. This territory is claimed. Trespassers face consequences. I raised the satellite phone with trembling fingers, no longer concerned about maintaining professional composure. Thompson reporting emergency situation. Trail blocked by arranged carcasses. Deliberate placement. Predator is displaying territorial warning behavior. Request immediate. The call died mid-sentence as a shadow detached itself from the vegetation directly ahead, beyond the grisly barricade. The creature emerged with fluid grace, positioning itself perhaps 30 feet away, well within the effective range of my weapon, but making no immediate aggressive movement. In the clear light of day, with no ridgeline distance or swirling snow to obscure details, I finally beheld the full reality of what had been stalking me. The creature was even larger than I had estimated during our first encounter, its shoulder height approaching 4 feet, with a body length excluding tail of perhaps 7 to 8 feet. The brindled coat displayed complex patterning that shifted with its movements, creating disorienting visual effects even in stillness. Its head was the most unsettling feature, a nightmare amalgamation of feline structure, with proportions that suggested something else entirely. The muzzle was shorter than a typical mountain lion's, the cranium larger and more domed. The eyes, amber with vertical pupils, conveyed an intelligence that transcended animal consciousness. They fixed on me with unmistakable recognition, not just as a generic human intruder, but as a specific individual it had encountered before. For several heartbeats, we remained frozen in mutual assessment. My service pistol was aimed at the center of its mass, finger tensed on the trigger. The creature made no aggressive movement, maintaining its position beyond the barrier of carcasses. Its tail twitched methodically from side to side, not the agitated lashing of an angry cat, but a measured, almost contemplative motion. Then, with deliberate slowness, it lowered its massive head toward one of the deer carcasses. Without breaking eye contact with me, it gripped the deer's shattered neck in powerful jaws and dragged the carcass to the side of the trail, clearing a narrow passage. The message couldn't have been clearer: "You may pass, but understand that I permit it." It retreated several steps, maintaining its position to the side of the trail but no longer directly blocking my path. The invitation or challenge was explicit. Professional training warred with primal instinct as I evaluated my options. Protocol dictated aggressive response to wildlife that displayed threatening behavior toward humans. But this was beyond the parameters of any wildlife management training I had received. This was negotiation, not predation. With the satellite phone still clutched in my left hand, service pistol in my right, I began moving forward. I skirted the remaining carcasses, giving them as wide a berth as the narrow trail permitted, while keeping my weapon trained on the creature. It watched my progress with that same unsettling intelligence, rotating its position to maintain optimal observation angle, but making no move to approach. As I drew parallel with its position, now separated by perhaps 15 feet of dense vegetation, it rose briefly to that same bipedal stance I had witnessed before. In this posture, it reached its full height, well over 7 feet tall, its proportions a disturbing blend of feline power and almost human articulation. It balanced there for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to ensure I had registered the display, then dropped back to all fours with fluid grace. I continued past, maintaining my pace and vigilance until I had put several bends in the trail between us. Only then did I break into a controlled run, pushing through the remaining section of the laurel hill with desperate energy. I emerged from the thicket into more open forest, the rancher cabin now visible approximately 400 yards ahead. And there, moving up the trail toward my position, were 3 figures in National Park Service winter uniforms, the extraction team, earlier than expected. Relief flooded through me as I waved to attract their attention. "Thompson," the lead figure called out, raising a hand in acknowledgement. "You okay? We've been trying to raise you on the radio." I glanced down at the satellite phone, realizing the call had disconnected during my confrontation with the creature. "Had a situation," I replied as I closed the distance between us. "Unidentified predator, territorial display. It's back there, in the laurel hill." The team leader, Davis, a veteran ranger I'd worked with for over a decade, frowned as he studied my face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, John. What exactly did you encounter?" I hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of how my experience would sound to others who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. "It's complicated. Large-felled, but unlike anything documented in the park, displayed extremely unusual behavior patterns." Davis exchanged glances with the other team members. "We should check it out. If there's an exotic predator in the park, we need to identify and potentially remove it before visitors start returning in the spring." "No." The force of my objection surprised even me. I moderated my tone. "Not now. It's demonstrating territorial behavior but hasn't shown direct aggression toward humans. We should consult with wildlife management specialists before attempting any intervention." Davis studied me for a long moment, clearly noting the tension in my voice and posture. "All right," he finally agreed. "Let's get back to the rancher cabin first, debrief properly. The storm's supposed to return by evening, so we need to move if we're going to make it back to headquarters today." The return journey passed in a blur of exhaustion and delayed shock. I provided a sanitized version of my experience to the extraction team, emphasizing the unusual size and coloration of the mountain lion, while downplaying the more inexplicable aspects of its behavior. Davis clearly remained skeptical but professional, focusing on the practical elements of the report rather than challenging my observations directly. We reached park headquarters shortly before sunset, where I was immediately directed to medical evaluation for potential hypothermia and stress effects. The examining physician found nothing physically amiss beyond expected fatigue and minor frostbite on my extremities, but recommended 48 hours of administrative leave for recovery, a recommendation I gratefully accepted. That night, in the security of my own home, I faced the decision that had been forming since my encounter on the ridge. Professional obligation demanded a full, accurate report of what I had witnessed: the territorial markers, the deliberate communication, the bipedal displays, the intelligence that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. Such a report would trigger extensive investigation and potential search operations in the area where I had encountered the creature. But another, deeper obligation gave me pause. For 20 years I had served as a steward of the wilderness, protecting its secrets and its sanctity from human encroachment and exploitation. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park represented one of the few remaining truly wild spaces in the eastern United States, a refuge, not just for documented species, but potentially for things that had evaded scientific classification. If I reported everything I had seen, what would follow? Teams with tranquilizer guns and tracking equipment, researchers with cameras and sampling kits, perhaps even hunters if the creature was deemed a threat to public safety. The remote ridgelines and hidden valleys would be systematically searched and cataloged, their mysteries exposed to human scrutiny. And for what? To confirm the existence of something that defied our understanding? To capture or kill it in the name of science or safety? To transform a living anomaly into a specimen or a cautionary tale? In the end, I filed a report documenting an encounter with an unusually large mountain lion, displaying atypical coloration and behavior patterns. I noted the territorial markings and recommended increased caution for any personnel operating in the remote northeastern section of the park, particularly during winter months when natural prey might be scarce. I suggested a wildlife camera survey during the spring season to establish population parameters and movement patterns without invasive intervention. The report was accepted without significant question. Mountain lion sightings, while uncommon in the Smokies, were not unprecedented. The unusual aspects of my encounter were attributed to stress, isolation, and challenging weather conditions affecting perception and judgment. The recommended camera survey was approved but assigned low priority given limited resources and the remote location involved. In the years since that winter, I have not returned to the emergency shelter or the ridge where I first encountered the creature. My duties have taken me to other sections of the park, other responsibilities that keep me primarily in more developed areas. This is by choice rather than coincidenza, conscious decision to respect territorial boundaries established through mutual understanding rather than human declaration. Occasionally during staff meetings or after-hours gatherings, colleagues will share stories of unexplained encounters in the backcountry, strange vocalizations that match no known species, glimpses of unusually large animals that defy easy categorization, inexplicable patterns of predation or territorial marking. I listen without comment, noting the locations mentally but offering no connection to my own experience. I have spent my career in park and recreational management, currently serving in the National Park Service as a superintendent. I have seen and heard many strange things while working in the backcountry. But there are some things that belong to the wilderness, alone secrets that should remain unclassified, undocumented, and undisturbed. The creature on the ridge is one of them.